Liberal MP Craig Kelly, who chairs the Coalition's Backbench Energy and Environment Committee. Craig Kelly, good to talk to you again.
Yeah, no, great to be here on this Saturday afternoon, Jim.
Indeed. Look, giving up a bit of your Queen's birthday weekend for us. Thank you very, very much indeed. Now, just on this question, Alan Finkel is arguing that the modelling that he has done would suggest that with his clean energy target, electricity prices in Australia could fall by $90 a year per household. That's a pretty attractive proposition, is it not?
Yeah, well, a couple of things on that, Jim. Firstly, the target that he's talking about is a 42% renewable energy target, effectively. Now, that is even further to the left than what Daniel Andrews is proposing for Victoria, where he's proposing a 40% renewable energy target. The second point to make is that the report actually starts out with electricity prices in this country at $300 a megawatt hour for consumers. So that equates to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, in New South Wales, we're down in the low 20s. So the starting point he's talking about is something like 40% higher than we already are. So the 10% off that in 10 years, even if the modelling is right, still is substantially higher than we already are here in New South Wales, and would effectively lock in some of the world's highest electricity prices for Australian consumers over the next decade and a half at least.
So are you with your colleague Erica Betts when he's suggesting that Dr Finkel is guilty of creative assumptions in coming up with this modelling? Do you doubt what he's suggesting? Look,
I think where he's suggesting is that we start at 30 cents a kilowatt hour as the average price for electricity. Now, what needs to be looked at is not only from the consumer's basis, but also from industry's basis. Now, I think the Finkel report talks of something around about $120 a megawatt hour. Now, the real question we need to ask, what does that do to Australia's international competitiveness? How does that price compare for industrial users vis-a-vis Canada and the USA and our other competitors in Southeast Asia? What effect will that have on jobs? What will it do to the economy? What will it do to wages growth? None of this is actually covered in the Finkel report, and that's why we need to make a full assessment of this before we make an informed decision.
It does sound like you're pretty sceptical of the reasoning behind this. Are you saying that the priority has to be cutting power prices rather than dealing with environmental considerations as a priority?
Jim, it has to be a balance of the two, and we have to get the figures clearly on the table so we're making an informed decision. Now, yes, we can cut our emissions, but at what cost is that to Australian consumers? What cost is it to the economy? How many jobs will that affect? And what happens if industry in Australia simply can't produce goods that need high amounts of electricity compared to other countries? Will we just see the displacement of industry in Australia? Will our entire, for example, aluminium industry be forced to move offshore? So even though, yes, we've had an emissions reduction in Australia, if that aluminium is still being made in a foreign country, we're likely to be higher emissions, so you're likely to have counterproductive effects of what you're actually trying to achieve.
So it does sound to me, if I can put it this way, would you then, is your inclination at the moment to recommend to the government that it think long and hard before adopting the findings of the Finkel inquiry? Do you think that there needs to be more work done on the economic implications,
well, there's been
the immediate economic implications of what he's recommending?
Absolutely, Jim. Just remember the Finkel report, even though it's 200-something pages long, it doesn't make any consideration whatsoever of what the long-term effects on the economy are, or it doesn't make any comparison how Australia's electricity prices will rate vis-a-vis other countries. And that is just such a critical step that we have to look at. Now, every country is different as far as its mix of electricity, how it's created. We have significant advantages here in Australia with our coal and our gas. We have significant disadvantages. We're a low, flat continent. Hydro is very difficult in Australia as compared to other countries. So, Jim, we need to make sure that we are looking this in the focus. We get this wrong, Jim. If we get this wrong, and we see electricity prices for industry skyrocket out of control, we are going to cause significant deindustrialisation of the nation, and we simply won't have the resources to fund all the things that we need to want to do in government.
What about the renewable energy target? You were expressing some scepticism about the notion of picking up on this 42% renewables target mentioned in Finkel, even though there are protections in his recommendations designed to ensure that in the transition to renewables, security of supply is guaranteed, either via battery storage, for example, or by contractual arrangements for those organisations that are producing intermittent power? Well,
Jim, firstly on some of the obligations, one of the things that the Finkel report talks about for security is to have a 3-year period, a notification period for a generator to pull out of the market. Now, that sounds great on paper. That sounds great from a bureaucracy in Canberra. But in the real world, I do not see how that can actually work. Firstly, are these businesses going to be forced to continue in business if they're losing money? What happens if they have a mechanical breakdown? We have got any type of industry that relies on big machinery, big spinning parts of metal. The chances of mechanical breakdown are something that would always need to be factored in. Now, to think you can legislate that from not happening, you just by a stroke of a pen, a piece of legislation, guarantee some supply stays in the market. I just am at a loss to see how that can be done in the real world.
And what about this question of these safeguards for renewable, particularly for wind power, that are there so that as they become cheaper and presumably more efficient, which they have done over time, that also there are guarantees for system-wide reliability?
Well, you're correct. That's the issue. Look, we saw here only last month there was a time when all of the wind turbines in the national grid, from South Australia down to Tasmania, up to Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, every single wind turbine was delivering zero electricity, not enough to run one 25-watt light bulb. So that is the problem with wind and solar. It's intermittency. When the wind doesn't blow, there's no power. And it doesn't matter where you locate the wind turbines around in the national grid, you've still got that same problem that can happen, that they will generate no additional electricity. So what we need is a certain amount of baseload or on-demand power. Now, how that's made up, whether that's made up of gas, coal, hydro, pumped hydro, battery storage, that is one of the questions that really needs to be set out and determined, and I don't see the full answers for that in the Finkel report.
Now, you would have to be happy, though, would you not, that there's no penalty for coal generation in this, and indeed that it's the settings are such that carbon capture and storage, if it proves to be economically feasible, would be a chance?
Look, if you are able to reduce your emissions with carbon capture and storage, why not go down the track and reduce emissions in that way if it can be done cost effectively? But that, Jim, has to be proved. But if it can be done, that's great. But let's just see if it can be done or not.
And one final question. Clearly there is a price signal in here. Do you still think this is too close to a carbon price to be acceptable to you and others on the coalition backbench?
Well, Jim, this is why we need the further modelling to see exactly what the full costs were and the effect to the economy. We simply can't go down the track of having unaffordable and continuing to have uncompetitive electricity prices in this nation. Because, as I said, the damage to the economy is just too great. The damage to consumer spending. If consumers have to spend more and more and more of their take-home pay on electricity, it means they have so much less to spend. If we can't get industry competitive, we're going to see industry move offshore and jobs lost. And that's, Jim, why we really need to take a very, very close look at this with the most finest of tooth comb to make sure we get this policy right for the future decades for our country.
Craig Kelly, do appreciate your time this Saturday afternoon, and particularly on a long weekend too. Some people never stop working. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.